Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's program here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. If you were with us yesterday, you know that we continued our explication. I'm using the word explication. That sounds pretty good. A pretty long word, a lot of letters. But most importantly, I mentioned explication because as I thought about the program after it was completed yesterday, I began to realize that, in effect, that's pretty much what we're doing, is I'm going through and pulling out, as we go through the document, paragraph by paragraph, I'm using the opportunity to elaborate on some of the things that are in there or clarify some of the things that are in there. And you know, again, it's making the trip through Federalist 10 longer than I had anticipated. I'm sure longer than many of you had anticipated as well. But at the same time, I really believe that some of the issues that are being raised in Federalist 10 are significant. Yesterday, particularly, I've got to say that, you know, yesterday I felt was one of those programs where it seemed to come together pretty well. I really believed at the end of yesterday's program that some of the points made, but more importantly, some of the points substantiated with historical evidence, with documentation, seemed to be very significant points, to be very substantial points that I think are well worth reflection, not only of a few people whose scholarship directs them to this period and to the Federalist Papers generally, Federalist 10 in particular, but the general audience, if you will. I really felt that some of the issues that we touched upon yesterday are quite significant. And I felt that a connection, I had been hopefully successful in making a connection between the 18th century and what's in Federalist 10, what's in the world that Federalist was written to address, and some of the things that are in our world and continue to go on. As I mentioned in our last half hour yesterday, we spent about an hour and a half, the first hour and a half of yesterday's program, on one sentence, one rather short sentence, actually, of Federalist number 10. And that is Madison's statement that the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. And based upon that, it seemed to me very important to focus upon the extent to which the generally accepted attitude or view toward man's nature is substantiated, is supported, is driven, if you will, by focus on statements like that. The fact that many people, because Madison said that factionalism is sown into the nature of man, many people seemingly have bought into what David Hume referred to in the mid-18th century as an established political maxim. And that established political maxim was that man's nature is so dark, so evil, that man's behavior is so dominated and driven by self-interest that it overwhelms all other activities that man might engage in. It dominates man's behavior. And Hume points out that traditionally this maxim, this assumption as to what human nature really is, has been the basis throughout history for this need, or the felt need or support for strong rulers. In other words, the maxim translates into a justification for power, political power. And then Hume proceeds to dispute these assumptions and begins to lay out an analysis which differentiates between man acting alone and man in interest groups or factions. And the conclusion, I think, that we need to reach when we consider David Hume in this context is that man's entry into a faction is tantamount to the dominance of self-interest, because the very glue that holds a faction together is the self-interest of the people that comprise that faction. And so if you are in a faction, then you have basically made the decision that gratifying or satisfying your own self-interest is, at least at that point, your priority. I think that's extremely significant, because what David Hume points out is that, in fact, that maxim is false, and that there is in man, besides a degree of self-interest, a so-called moral sense, a concern for the welfare of others, an innate goodness, if you will, that exists within man's nature as well as self-interest. And so consequently, checks on behavior or controls on behavior, like, for example, honor, reputation, the felt need to impress other people, trying to meet and satisfy the expectations of other people. Many of these concerns serve as a check on human behavior to the point that they permit man's better side to come forth and be exercised. In other words, these kinds of considerations are able to dominate self-interest for the most part when man is alone. But once man becomes part of a faction, self-interest is in control. And man's reason convinces him that the best way to satisfy self-interest is to organize or unite with other people with the same interest. That, Hume says, is the basis for the political maxim that man's self-interest dominates his nature. But as Hume points out, that's false. There's a competition or a struggle, if you will, within man between his inclinations to do good and his self-interest. And it's the entry into factions or groups that enables self-interest to dominate. And then we looked at some of the quotations from James Madison that tended to reinforce that particular point of view. And, I don't think it would be remiss to say that probably Douglas Adair, as much as anybody, is responsible for establishing the influence of the thinking and writing of David Hume on James Madison, on Hamilton, and some of the other founders of the 18th century. So, and what you find is substantial evidence that Hume's thinking on man's nature as not being totally driven by self-interest is supported, is agreed to by Madison, Hamilton, and the others, and we looked at some of the evidence of that effect. After yesterday's program, and I beg your tolerance here, but after yesterday's program, I was, if physically, if I could have done it, I could have gone on for another couple of hours. I was really wound up about this particular issue and excited by it. And the reason is because I think some things came together that have been floating around out there but have been largely unconnected for some time. And in yesterday's program, it seemed like things fell into place to the point that all of these things seemed to fit into a pattern. And I made the decision last evening to take a few hours and do the best I could to put some of this into writing while it was still fresh in my mind. And so I sat down and I began to sketch out the outlines of some of the support, some of the documentation that we cited yesterday in order to try to put it together in a context in writing which would make it available to other people in the future. And then this morning, in preparation for today's program, I spent a couple of more hours doing the best I could to kind of clean up my language and work on a little bit of the transitions from one paragraph to the other until I came up with a document, actually about 20 minutes before we went on the air, came up with a document that I think pretty well captures yesterday's program. In effect, what I'm thinking is that if I share this document with you, I'm doing two things. I'm reinforcing some of the points we made in yesterday's program, but more important, I'm doing what we usually do at the beginning of a program, which is a review or an overview of the previous program as a lead into the current one. So my feeling is before we proceed with our explication of Federalist number 10, and clearly this will probably extend into at least a portion of next week's programming as well, that I would, if you can stand it, I would like to share with you a document that I was able to put together, which I hope constitutes the kind of review that you will find helpful. I have every intention of posting this at some point in the next day or two on the Facebook page. If I can refine it to the point that I'm comfortable with it, I'd like to submit it and hope that one of our newspapers, and I'm thinking specifically of the Charleston Gazette, which has been kind enough to publish several of the pieces that I've sent them over the last year, would be willing to publish this, because I think it is really important. And I think all of us, when you write anything, you have to believe it's important. Otherwise, you couldn't do it. But I really do believe, and I'm hoping that I'm able to demonstrate this, that many things in today's world that might befuddle us a bit seem to fall into a pattern. It may not be the only pattern. It may not be the right one. But it's a pattern that seems to make sense to me. And I'm hoping that at least to a degree, it makes some sense to you. So with that, if I can, let me share this document as an opportunity to review a little bit of yesterday's program and put us in a position where we can move on, if you will, in Federalist number 10. I've entitled this piece, and I don't know whether this is proper or not, but I've entitled this piece, When Right and Wrong Depend on Circumstance. And I've said, and some of this, I put the first few paragraphs of this on Facebook last week, and I wasn't really comfortable with what I ended up with, so I'm hoping that this will improve it. Is it true that who we are is a function of where we are and who's there with us? I'm guessing that most of us would waffle on this question, likely looking for ways to not answer it. But how much does what we believe or what we're willing to do depend Not on what that little voice inside tells us what we should do, but how we read those around us, how we think they'll react to what we decide finally to do. Am I a different person when I'm alone than when I'm not? How vulnerable am I to groupthink? How willing am I to say things and do things in a group that I'd never even consider if I were alone? For generations, societies have addressed man's need to posture, to impress. Most featured behavior manuals for aspiring elites, social climbers as well as already theirs, intent on knowing the right things to say and do when it most matters. From the early sophists on language and Confucius on correct social behavior, to Louis XIV and Shaftesbury on etiquette, Ben Franklin and George Washington on good manners. From Erasmus on behavior that's proper, Madame Bovary on behavior that's not, to Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, Robert's Rules of Order for the rough and tumble business world, finishing schools and cotillion for those destined for a life far less strenuous. Cultures have always stressed posturing, presentation, and positioning as keys to how far we'd be able to go. All well and good, you say. But how in the world does any of this pertain to the Constitution? Other than as commentary on how so many of America's founders were raised, how does any of this relate to the legacy they left us or what we need to do to preserve it? And with that introduction, then, we get into some of the substantive documentation that we looked at yesterday. Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist number 15, challenged the common notion, and this is a quote, that bodies of men act with more rectitude or greater disinterestedness than individuals, unquote. On the contrary, he argued, all accurate observers of the conduct of mankind deny this, recognizing instead that, quote, a spirit of faction, when it visits all bodies of men, will often hurry the persons of whom they are composed into improprieties and excesses for which they would blush in a private capacity. I kind of messed up the tone of that, so let me repeat that sentence. In Federalist number 15, to paraphrase, Hamilton challenged the existing belief that men will behave better in groups than they will as individuals. On the contrary, he argued, and this is the quote, all accurate observers of the conduct of mankind deny this, recognizing instead that a spirit of faction, when it visits all bodies of men, will often hurry the persons of whom they are composed into improprieties and excesses for which they would blush in a private capacity, unquote. Individuals may want to do what's right, but honor and good conscience seem impotent in the face of group pressure. One of the world's most notable accurate observers of the conduct of mankind was David Hume. He referenced the popular political maxim that every man must be supposed a knave, by declaring it to be false in fact. Men are generally more honest in their private than in their public capacity, he said, and will go to greater lengths to serve a party than when their own private interest is alone concerned, unquote. In a 17-page letter in October 1787, James Madison reported to Thomas Jefferson on the Constitution completed just over a month earlier in Philadelphia. In it, he derided the power of factions to elevate the extremes of self-interest over man's innate moral sense. Religion, Madison acknowledged, has proven itself ineffective in checking negative human behavior, however much believers might wish otherwise. Quote, "The conduct of every popular assembly acting on oath, the strongest of religious ties, shows that individuals join without remorse in acts against which their consciences would revolt if proposed separately to them in their closets," unquote. In other words, Hamilton, Hume, and now Madison, all of them, basically acknowledge the existence within man of a moral sense that is overwhelmed by factions, by the self-interest that drives factions. To go on. In a side of Madison few seem eager to own, let alone highlight, we see him acknowledge in Federalist number 55, quote, "a degree of depravity in mankind that warrants some caution and distrust." Again, in Federalist number 55, Madison is admitting that there is within man a degree of depravity that warrants caution and some distrust. But, Madison said, it is offset by other qualities in human nature that justify esteem and confidence. Seemingly anticipating the famous dissent of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the case of Lochner versus New York in 1905, Madison was especially eager to warn of those determined to persuade us, quote, "that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, and that nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another," unquote. In other words, Madison in Federalist 55, is warning us of those who will actively promote the idea that man's nature is so bad that he cannot participate in self-government in a positive way. In other words, these are people who are opposed to republicanism and opposed to self-government, and therefore have a vested interest in convincing the public that human nature is so bad that self-government is merely a dream, an ideal that can never be realized. Madison in number 55 is warning all of us against those people. Hamilton challenged this supposition of universal venality in human nature as well, alluding to the principle of delegation of power as evidence, quote, "that there is a portion of virtue and honor among mankind which may be a reasonable foundation of confidence." In other words, not only Madison warns of those people who would try to persuade us that man's nature is more evil than it really is, but now he's joined by Hamilton, who says in Federalist number 76 the very same thing. So these founders are alerting us to the efforts of those who have a vested interest, self-interest, in promoting and selling a dark side view of human nature, which is the only way that they can continue to garner public support for their own agendas. And Hamilton and Madison both warn us of this. Despite persistent denial from those with a political agenda that demands otherwise, Most of America's founders endorsed a view of human nature far more complex and less negative than that of the self-interested knave most often presented. Thomas Jefferson, for example, explained, quote, "Man was destined for society. His morality, therefore, was formed to this object. He was endowed with a sense of right and wrong merely relative to this. This sense is as much a part of his nature as the sense of hearing, seeing, feeling. It is the true foundation of morality." So here's Jefferson saying that man's nature is positive, and man indeed does have within him an innate sense of morality. Back to the text. Jefferson implied that this moral sense, always there, could be overwhelmed by reason, especially when it was developed to a high degree. Quote, "State a moral case to a plowman and a professor. The former will decide it as well and often better than the latter, because he has not been led astray by artificial rules." In other words, the highly sophisticated skill of reason, of cognitive analysis, enables man to rationalize behavior that oftentimes goes against what his innate sense of goodness tells him is right. Here, Jefferson seems to be telling us is the source of man's inclination to rationalize, to master skills that transform what initially are wrongs into self-serving rights. It's learned behavior that our higher education system polishes to a fine sheen. In the process, man's innate sense of right and wrong is driven deeper within him. Conscience might never totally abandon us, but less and less can it prevail the more cognitively skilled we become. The more education, the more polished our skills of analysis become, the more difficult it is for the innate goodness within us to dominate. Most, and this is kind of my conclusion, and I think this is, I hope, something that you can be comfortable with. Most can accept the idea of man's more positive nature in Jefferson. Anyone who claimed that all men are created equal and blessed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness had to have his head pretty high in the clouds anyway. That the Hamilton and Madison portrayed here are so totally unfamiliar to us is the issue. The maxim of man as knave is as alive today as it was in David Hume's world. That so few challenge it explains why Hume remains a total unknown. As did Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, Hume blamed an overemphasis on the dark side of human nature, the belief that man could have, quote, no other end in all his actions than private interest, unquote. He blamed this for man's desire to seek the strong ruler. It served to legitimize political power. A like mindset about human nature has emerged as maxim in today's economic world that drives contemporary capitalism and the consumer mentality that sustains it. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes warned us more than a century ago in his Lochner versus New York dissent that, quote, a constitution is not intended to embody a particular economic theory, unquote. In fact, that is exactly what we have allowed to happen. It's hard to deny the validity of the Pope's concern in Laudato Si that man's total fixation on economic development and the self-interested values that drive it, as unquestioned confirmation of man's nature, bereft of any moral dimension whatever, does indeed threaten the planet. It's even more difficult to not question the degree to which scholars as enablers, in pursuit of wealthy patrons or grants, have compromised their professional integrity to cherry-pick America's past for evidence to sustain what they are being paid to find. Not only have we taken the founders' words out of context to promote a narrow, self-serving economic agenda, we have consciously repressed evidence from these same sources that would refute it. Publius, the voice of Madison, Hamilton, and Jay in The Federalist, has been compromised in order to promote the dark side view of human nature, while the sources cited above to suggest something quite different never make it into our textbooks and classrooms. So what's the answer? Is the conservative attack on the Common Core yet another example of ideological determination to keep the young on track for entry into a world which they continue to insist that they embrace? And what of Donald Trump's poll numbers? What chords is he touching in the electorate? Is the Donald really a phenomenon? Or is he merely the product of a maxim that we continue to promote? It seems to me, as I was putting this together, after watching last Thursday night's Republican debate, that the chords that Donald Trump is touching, the poll numbers that he is achieving, clearly indicate that he's touching something in the electorate that others have heretofore been unable to touch. What is it? When you think about the criticisms of Trump's campaign so far, its lack of specificity, its lack of substance, his willingness to almost say anything and do anything, to never apologize, never equivocate, never negotiate, never compromise, never take a step backwards in order to justify 2 steps forward. All the things that the pundits say will keep Donald Trump from having a reasonable shot at getting the Republican nomination. These are the things, apparently, that significant numbers of the electorate want to hear. Those that have already committed to Trump say that the things he's saying have needed to be said for a long time, but nobody would do it. And there seems to be a general consensus forming that more than anything else, what possibly could sink Trump's campaign is if he begins to be politician, if he begins to equivocate, if he begins to dodge questions, if he refuses to answer certain questions. Then he'll be one of the usual crowd, and his numbers will begin to plummet. So, in effect, what it is that those who are leaning toward Trump at this point, what it is they are after, what it is they feel that the nation needs, is the very same thing that the political maxim David Hume wrote about 3 centuries ago. became the foundation for the need for a strong ruler. In other words, Trump's positions on China and Mexico and bringing jobs back and all the rest of it are suggesting that all the qualities within our political system, embedded within our political system of compassion and compromise and willing to negotiate and deliberation and all the rest of it, are signs of weakness. And around the world, leaders in other countries are taking advantage of us for that. What Trump is in effect promising is that if I'm president, they'll never get away with any of this stuff again. In other words, I will be a president that, as he said straight up, that Putin will respect. Well, it seems to me that if you're going to basically aim for the respect of Putin by functioning on the level that Putin functions on, then you are, in a sense, ratifying, endorsing, rationalizing the view of human nature that we've been talking about here, the so-called dark side. Because what you are doing is repudiating all evidence, all indications of anything in human nature other than self-interest that drives behavior. And Trump, of course, is able to promote his own success, his own financial success, his ability to deal with other entrepreneurs, with other billionaires. In other words, he's suggesting that what he brings to the political table are skills and abilities and experience that we've never had access to before. And once we get them, once we elect him, and once we get these particular skills in the White House, then America once again can kick ass. That America can once again dominate. That America can once again become the exceptional nation that so many people believe it is and ought to be. It's incredible that all of this could be foretold, could be predicted in a document written by James Madison 300 years ago, 250, 60 years ago. It's amazing. Anyway, that's what I've been able to do since last time we were together yesterday afternoon here at the Virtual Center. And I want to thank you for your indulgence. As I read it, I began to see that certain things needed to be cleaned up. I need to go back and touch up a number of things in it in order to refine it. But in a sense, I think it pretty much explains not only why we believe what we believe, but why those who continue to promote it do so. Why the Madison and the Hamilton that we always hear about is the Madison who says, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government at all. Or the latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. And those are used in order to promote a particular agenda that is built on the basis, on the foundation of the dark side of human nature. That's the side that we have chosen to adopt. That's the side that we have chosen to promote. That's the side we have done everything we can do to repress. We don't want our young people to see it. We don't want it in curriculum. We don't want it in textbooks. We don't want it imported in books from other countries. So as Jefferson tells us in 1816, in the United States Senate, enact a tariff on foreign books in order to keep dangerous foreign ideas out of America's schools. Common Core, No Child Left Behind, doesn't matter what we're talking about. We really have not yet made the decision to begin finally to give our young people the opportunity to really learn and experience an education, to think, to discover, to analyze, to speculate, to rank, to evaluate, to do all the things that are associated with a level of education that has constantly and consciously been denied the masses. For the most part, it's been available to the few, but it's been denied to the masses with a justification that it would be, quote, over the heads of many of our young people. It would unduly stress them. It would unduly create pressures on them. It would cause psychological reverberations that we wouldn't want. I would suggest to you that learning doesn't do that. Evaluation and ranking of people does. The pressures of standardized tests, the pressures of testing, the pressures of comparison, the pressures of rewarding performance or merit, that kind of pressure does stress. But I would suggest to you the experience of real learning does not create stress. It creates excitement. It makes people exuberant. It makes people want more. It makes people question. It makes people think. It makes people creative. It makes people develop a positive attitude toward the future. It indeed would make all of our young people, make America competitive again. But it's very clear that we have yet to make the decision that we want to go there. Whenever something surfaces, like the Common Core, that seems to indicate that we might possibly be going there, or at least close to there, then the forces that be take up the cause and do everything they can to derail or stifle these kinds of reforms. Anyway, it is 50 minutes after the hour, and even with just a few 10 minutes left in our first hour today, I'd like to take this opportunity now to go back to James Madison's Federalist Number 10 and begin to proceed beyond the point where we were yesterday, where Madison was explaining his statement that the latent causes of factions are sown into the nature of man. And I remind you again that Madison's explanation of these examples of factions is based on his indication or his explanation that man is inclined to join factions, to seek organization with others who agree for not only serious, but oftentimes for very frivolous reasons. People tend to look at others, look at the world, if you will, from a perspective, from an us versus them perspective. We tend to seek out those who agree with us. We tend to keep at arm's length those who don't. When we turn on the news, we tend to turn on those channels whose view of the news most closely mirrors our own. We don't want to be surprised. We don't want to be challenged. We want to be massaged. We want our views and our opinions and our prejudices and our biases to be reaffirmed, not challenged. And so by consciously then, we choose not to go to those outlets, those sources, which might indeed make the situation uncomfortable for us. We tend to gravitate where we're most comfortable. We tend to spend as much time as we can with those who agree with us, not those who don't. And so this human tendency, it seems to me, merely reinforces a particular view of man and a particular view of human nature, and it plays right into the hands of those who would promote that view. Theoretically, at least, in the abstract, education is the one experience that ought not to be a player or a party in that particular effort. Theoretically, education is the place where we are exposed to ideas that are different from our own, that we are challenged, that many of the things we take for granted are challenged, where we are forced to defend a particular point of view, where we are forced to experience an alternative point of view. Theoretically, education, the experience of education, school, college, whatever, is, in theory, the place where biases and prejudices will be challenged and confronted. But as we know, as we've just talked about, that ain't happening. Because there are a lot of people in this country that don't want it to happen. At least not for the many. And as we'll recall from yesterday, when Madison talked about the latent causes of faction being sown into the nature of man, Madison made the very prominent, important statement that the most common and durable sorts of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. The gap, the divisions between rich and poor have always been the major source of factions which have always tended to bring down popular government. And as we know, because Madison told us earlier, these inequalities, these differences between those with and those without property are linked directly to the different faculties of man. That people are different. They have different skills, different abilities, different talents, different drive, different families, different genes, all of that. And the number one priority, Madison says, of government is to regulate these various and interfering interests. And that naturally means that we've got to deal with factions. We've got to deal with the spirit of party and faction and the necessary and ordinary operations of the government. So Madison has come full circle, at least as far as we've gone so far. Madison began by saying that you can either eliminate the causes of factions or you can control the results. First, he took on the elimination of causes. And he pointed out that there were two ways to eliminate causes. And then he proceeded to shoot down both of them as being impossible. consequently, he has brought us to the point where the only thing we can do is figure out how to regulate or control the effects of factions. And so what he says is, since factions are natural, and since factions are a direct product of individual freedom, it naturally stands to reason that the issue of faction must be an ordinary, regular part of government. Since we can't get rid of them, we've got to figure out a way to control them. And that leads us to the second part, if you will, part 2 of this particular document. From here on in, Madison is going to be dealing with the issue of controlling the effects of factions, since in the first 2 pages he has eliminated all the options for trying to eliminate the causes of faction. I think that's where we are. And of course it's kind of ironic and timely that we're right at the top, pretty much at the top of our first hour as we reach this point. So with the clock showing 58 minutes after the hour, as we begin to launch into the second part of Federalist number 10, I believe that this is an appropriate time for us to pause and take our regular break, our regular music, hear our regular music interlude from Bob Kincaid. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We will pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back with our second hour of our program here at the Virtual Center on this Wednesday, the 12th day of August, 2015. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's Dr. Bill.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour here on this Wednesday, the 12th day of August in the year 2015. A beautiful, absolutely gorgeous Wednesday afternoon. It is a pleasure to be with you, as I mentioned earlier. If you were with us through our first hour and you have remained with us, I want to thank you for doing that. If you are just joining us, we spent our first hour pretty much reviewing what I hope is the thrust or the essence of the program we did yesterday. We have reached it seems to me, a logical breaking point, if you will, for the start of this, our second hour, because we have reached the point at which Madison has eliminated the first half of the strategy he laid out for dealing with the violence of factions. Remembering that he said we can either eliminate the causes or control the results. And he, after identifying 2 different strategies for eliminating causes, and successfully refuting each of them, we have reached the point where Madison has concluded that we are confronted with only the second option, which is the need to control the effects of factions. And Madison closed the paragraph that we just ended with by making the statement that we need to deal with the fact, then, that factions, since they can't be eliminated, must become part of the every ordinary necessary functions of government. In other words, if we can't eliminate them, we've got to find a way to incorporate them into the way we structure our government, the way we organize our government. We know they're going to be there. What we have to do is make sure that they are not ever in a position where they can exercise the violence that usually associates or accompanies factions. So somehow we've got to regulate them in such a way or manage them in such a way that they will not be able to take advantage of the self-interest that is the basis for the existence of that or any particular faction. I invite you to participate actively in our program by taking advantage of the phone line that we have available to get you on the air. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. If you'd like to share your thoughts with me one-on-one basis via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And finally, I encourage you to check out our Facebook page. Just go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you'll gain access to our page. And I think it was last Saturday that I put the last post on our Facebook page, other than a notification that our programs this week would be focusing on a continued explication of Federalist Number 10. But I really do believe that in the next day or two, I'll be able to post the document that I shared with you in our first hour, which is pretty much a review of the program we did yesterday here at the Virtual Center on the first section of Madison's Federalist Number 10. I think we have reached the point then where we are ready to launch into the process or the procedure, the strategy that Madison divines, if you will, for controlling the effects of factions. So let me begin by sharing with you this text from Madison's Federalist Number 10. From this view of the I'm in the wrong place. Okay. No man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause, Madison says, because his interest would certainly bias his judgment and not improbably corrupt his integrity. I think that's pretty much self-explanatory. We all accept that. We hear it all the time. No man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause because his interest would certainly bias his judgment and not improbably corrupt his integrity. With equal, nay, with greater reason, a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. So what Madison is doing here, it seems to me, is bolding or reinforcing the point that he has made earlier. And that is that we all agree that no man can be both judge and jury in his own particular situation. Because as Madison points out, and everybody would agree, if it's his own self-interest that is at stake, that's going to bias his judgment, and it's probably going to corrupt his integrity. Now Madison gets into the meat, because he's in effect saying, if this is true for an individual, for one person, there's even greater reason that a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. If self-interest is liable to dominate, is likely going to dominate the integrity of one person, think of what it will do with a whole group of people with the same self-interest. In other words, Madison is taking the issue that he developed in the first part of the document, which is that man is much more likely to do what's right than wrong when he's alone than he is when he's member of the group. So consequently, if you can't let a single person be a judge and jury in his own case, you surely can't let a self-interested faction or group of men do that either. Yet, he says, if this is true, What are many of the most important acts of legislation, but so many judicial determinations, not indeed concerning the rights of single persons, but concerning the rights of large bodies of citizens? In other words, if we believe that a body of men ought not to be both judge and jury in their own behavior, concerning their own self-interest, what are our laws? Our acts of legislation, the laws we pass. But these are judicial determinations, not indeed concerning the rights of single persons, but concerning the rights of large bodies of citizens. When we pass a law affecting a group of persons, by definition, the legislature, the body that passes it, has become an interest group because they all vote the same way. And, he continues, what are the different classes of legislators but advocates and parties to the causes which they determine? The whole idea of being a member of a legislature is to sell the things you vote for, or sell the reasons why you should not vote against the things that you don't want. In other words, part of your job as legislator is not only to vote, but to justify your vote to those who elect you. Is a law, now he's giving examples of this, is a law proposed concerning private debts? It is a question to which the creditors are parties on one side and the debtors on the other. It is a question to which the creditors are parties on one side and the debtors on the other. Justice ought to hold the balance between them. Yet the parties are and must be themselves the judges. And the most numerous party, or in other words, the most powerful faction, must be expected to prevail. In other words, the mere breaking down of legislative bodies into majorities and minorities on particular pieces of legislation, by definition, creates interest groups, creates factions. And so it stands to reason that if, as Madison says, if you're going to pass a law affecting debts, then naturally your debtors are going to be on one side, your creditors are going to be on the other side. So by definition, they're both self-interested. They ought not to be judges and juries. But obviously the decision's going to be made by the majority. So if the creditors are in the driver's seat, the law will reflect that. If the debtors are in the driver's seat, the law will reflect that. So in a sense, what he's pointing out here is that our very legislative system itself is driven to a large degree by factions, by self-interest. Shall domestic manufacturers be encouraged? And in what degree? By restrictions on foreign manufacturers. In other words, if we're going to pass a law protecting our manufacturers by restricting foreign manufacturers by raising the tariffs on them, these are questions which would be differently decided by the landed and the manufacturing classes, and probably by neither with a sole regard to justice and the public good. By definition, a law affecting manufacturing is a law that's going to touch so many self-interests that it's not possible to avoid factionalism in the decision. The apportionment of taxes on the various descriptions of property is an act which seems to require the most exact impartiality. One would think that in passing taxes and assessing taxes, the process ought to be as impartial as possible. Yet, he says, there is perhaps no legislative act in which greater opportunity and temptation are given to a predominant party to trample on the rules of justice. Every shilling with which they overburden the inferior number, the minority, is a shilling saved to their own pockets. The conclusion of that paragraph, then, if we were to kind of wrap up that paragraph, what Madison is saying is, when you get into government, everything that government does when it comes to passing legislation involves the issues of faction, interest groups, minority votes and majority votes. And consequently, the result is going to play to self-interest. If the debtors are in the majority, the law will reflect that. If the creditors are in the majority, the law will reflect that. In manufacturing, if the manufacturers have the predominance of votes, the legislation will reflect that. If the landed interests are in the majority, the vote will reflect that, and so on. Even in the apportionment of taxes, he points out that, just by recognizing that every dollar that somebody else pays is a dollar that you don't have to, by definition, self-interest is at play. Now Madison begins to lay out the ground rules for a solution. He said, "It is vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good." In other words, we'd like to believe that somehow enlightened statesmen are going to come to the fore, resolve the competing interests, and somehow subject all the competing interests to the public interest. In other words, we'd love to believe that somehow self-interest is not going to dominate the result. But he says it's vain, it's a waste of time to believe that. We're whistling Dixie, we're blowing wind if we believe that that's going to happen. Enlightened statesmen, he says, will not always be at the helm. They won't always be there. Nor, in many cases, can such an adjustment be made at all without taking into view indirect and remote considerations, which will rarely prevail over the immediate interest which one party may find in disregarding the rights of another or the good of the whole. In other words, we are living in a dream world if we believe that in this kind of a hostile, competitive, rivalry type situation, on issues related directly to self-interest, we are naive if we believe that somehow the public interest is ever going to prevail. It can't. It can't. The inference to which we are brought, in other words, we finally reach the point, Madison says, where we realize that the causes of faction cannot be removed and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. In other words, Madison is saying exactly what we entered this hour saying, that we have reached the point where we have to conclude that we cannot eliminate the causes of faction. They are embedded in the way we do business, in the way governments do business. Because everything that government discusses, everything that government enacts in terms of legislation is related to somebody's self-interest. So by definition, factions are so embedded in our political process, there's no way we can get rid of them. There's no way that enlightened statesmen are going to come riding in on white stallions and rescue us by defining for us the public interest and making certain that the public interest prevails. We're dreaming if we think that's going to happen. So Madison's conclusion is the inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction can't be removed, and relief is only to be sought in controlling its effects. Somehow, we're going to have to figure out a way that the effects of factions are controlled so that somehow the public interest has a chance, that self-interest doesn't always rule the day. Now Madison is going into analysis that I believe is critical. And I'm asking that as I read this, if you will just think along with Madison. In other words, he's going to take us on a short intellectual trip. He's going to say, if this is true, then this is true. And if both those things are true, then this is true, etc., etc. He's going to basically lay out a procedure for us that's going to make the point that he wants to make. He says, if a faction consists of less than a majority, remember, it can either be a majority or a minority of the whole. It's an interest group. If a faction consists of less than a majority, Madison says, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. What, in effect, is Madison saying here? The minority faction is not the problem. Because if the minority faction tries to satisfy its own self-interest, the majority will always outvote it. So in effect, what Madison is saying is the minority faction is not really our problem. I need to pause here and call your attention to something. Madison has gone to great lengths to explain that the division of society into those with property and those without property, the rich and the poor, has always been the major source of factions. Now he's saying that the minority faction's not our problem, because the majority faction will always keep it from having its way. So in the context of property ownership, what Madison is saying is that those with property, the wealthy, are not our problem. It's pretty obvious then who is the problem. And Madison goes on. In terms of the minority, where relief will be supplied by the Republican principle, Madison says it, meaning the minority, it may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. Minorities, factions, can form all sorts of problems. They can be a pain in the ass. They can convulse society. But they will never be able to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution.
Hey, Bill.
Yes, Bob.
I just wanted to let you know that Horst has chimed in and is with us
great.
now.
Great. Horst, how are you?
Hi, Dr. Bill. How are you? I'm doing good.
I've been really worried about you, man.
Oh,
I wondered if you had your bathing suit. My God.
Didn't need it.
I couldn't believe the amounts of rain they were saying fell over there.
The city I'm in, or the area I'm in, is on the inside of the straits, so we're like we're facing the mainland. We're kind of like on that coast, so it's very, very difficult for a windstorm to hit us directly here.
Right.
This one did a pretty good job of it, though. Anyway, it just came straight over the mountains, and usually there's a big steep spine of mountains going over the center of the island that really disrupts a lot of the heavy winds and stuff like that. But
yeah,
we got hit pretty good considering all that. But again, even for this region, I live in an area where we get the mildest of everything.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, so we came out pretty okay this time. Although when I went to work, 3 or 4 panels of the side of the building had been blown off, and the boss was out there riveting it back together. So.
Oh my heavens!
Yeah,
well, you know, I saw reports of 35 and 40 inches of rain. I mean, my God, that's incredible.
Yeah. Well, when these storms sweep through, they're actually the front of it when it comes in. It's high winds typically, and then you get the eye of the storm, which in a hurricane is pretty sizable.
Yes.
It can last for hours, you know, and then.
Yeah.
Then when you're in the tail, that's when all the rain comes, and if you're in an area that's subject to flooding, which, you know, we're on the side of a mountain here, so depending on what street you're on, it's either a problem or it isn't. And again, our house is just in a good spot for that. So,
well, I'm glad. I know a lot of people got hurt, though. I understand that. You know, it was bad. Yeah, it was bad. I think it's just an indication of how extremes it was. I mean, the weather. Looking on the map, the weather maps of the Pacific, the size of the storm was incredible.
Yeah, and as I understand, it was still only actually technically like a Category 3 or something like that. So, or that's what I'd gathered. So it could have been much more something, I suppose, either higher wind speeds or whatever. But it's not an area of expertise for me. I just know for this region we got the biggest winds and the most damage I've seen in probably 10 years.
Yeah. It was pretty obvious that that's what was going to happen. I mean, they had it pretty well forecast and pretty well fingered that this was going to be bad. And you know, but obviously I don't know anybody over there but you, and I only know you through these conversations. But at the same time, I knew somebody that was there, so I was a little bit concerned.
It's going to be a small world, huh? Yeah.
Yeah, huh? That's true. What you got?
Well, I thought it's kind of been tickling me on this faction thing for a while anyway, but today I couldn't help but notice, you know, something in the language of how, since factions in government, you know,
right,
are unavoidable, and so therefore we have to think of ways of restraining and reining the power in, checking the powers, and making sure that okay, because we can't just eliminate them outright. So if you allow this kind of organization to exist, then there have to be mechanisms to rein in, to make sure that power can't go unchecked, or possibly another balancing act, you know, where factions are pitted against each other in another sort of checks and balances systems. And I got to thinking, you know what that reminds me of almost exactly? It reminds me a lot of you know, the basic capitalist theory that our economy was based on from more or less the beginning, in the sense that, you know, if you let the free market just laissez-faire, you know, as was you know, as they had back then, that's not going to work, and so you need regulation. In other words, you need curbs to keep a private market from going out of control and basically factionalizing itself. And what struck me particularly is how that seems to, what we're seeing now is that our capitalist system is, you know, our regulations are gone, our curbs are gone, more or less, or they're eroding so fast that in many instances, in many sectors, they might as well not even exist. And
I see what you mean.
What you see is not only that this section has taken control, is getting out of control. It's actually it's becoming the government in a lot of areas. You look at the FDA, you look at agriculture, agribusiness, that kind of thing. And I was wondering, what is the ultimate economic faction is a corporation. And as I understand it, the founders had some notion of what a corporation was, and they were not in favor of them. Or I don't know if at the time of the founding, I'm hazy on this one, but
right.
I seem to recall a bit of trivia that corporations as such were not even legal until the mid-1840s. Up to that point, like, you could only have like legal partnerships, and that was as big or as concentrated as a privately held company could get. And it got me thinking, what did a faction mean to these people in the 1780s, or the late 18th century anyway, who had spent most of their lives under a British parliamentary system? I mean, what I understand what faction means to me, and I get a sense of what they describe from the papers and all that. It's just competing interests. When I studied this in school, they said, well, the classic example is like a political action committee, and that was kind of the way we looked at it.
Right.
But such things that didn't really exist in those times. I wonder what they were talking about, and what they had in mind when they were discussing this. Because I'm sure they had like very concrete examples, like things that were happening in their world at that time. So I was going to ask you about that, number one. But at the same time, I couldn't help pointing out like the similarity between like economic factions and government factions, and what happens. What we're seeing now, we're seeing a merging of the two. Corporate power is government power now, and corporations to me are like the ultimate faction. Period. They're like, forget political action committees. Those are just like money pipelines from the corporations. They're the real powers. Those are the real factions, and they are in a sense they're actually becoming governments unto themselves. And or
great. That's a great.
Or maybe a little more like warring tribes, basically.
It's a great question. It's a great question, and it's a great point, and a great question. As far as corporations initially in the early 18th century, the general public was very, very skeptical of corporations. I mean, there was a lot of negative feeling toward corporations. For one thing, because they had advantages that people didn't have. I mean, they by definition, state governments made it possible for corporations to reduce risk. In other words, by passing limited liability laws, for example, then you basically encouraged entrepreneurism by minimizing the risk of going into business, of a corporation going into business. What you basically guaranteed was that the individuals who make it up will not be wiped out for the rest of their lives if the thing fails, by limiting the liability. And a lot of people were very, very uncomfortable about that, because they felt that gave corporations protections that individual people didn't have. If you as an individual take a risk and invest in something and it fails, you're in trouble. You're wiped out. And John Marshall, in some of his decisions, goes really out of the way to try to explain that in spite of the fact that corporations are man-made creations, they are created for a purpose. But that doesn't mean, and they need to be free enough to complete or to do the job for which they were created. Matt Marshall's analysis is based on the idea, if government creates a corporation, it's because government believes that the public interest will best be served by the creation and operation of this corporation. And therefore, since it was created to do the public's will, to do the public's job, it must be granted enough freedom to do what it was created to do. But on the other hand, it needs to be tightly regulated to make sure that it can't do other things in other areas which are beyond the scope of why it was created. In other words, the idea being, what Madison is basically saying is, the public can trust corporations because government can trust government to regulate them. And thereby, we get we get the opportunity or the benefits of private organizations that come into being for purposes of satisfying a particular part of the public interest. And that's an advantage we can't afford to not take, to not have access to. So, yeah, and the reason is because you're right, in terms of the parliamentary background. Most Americans who were at all familiar with their history as colonies of the mother country, the only corporations they saw in England were things like the South Sea Bubble and the South Sea Corporation and these other scams, these Ponzi schemes and the rest, where corporate interests were able to buy influence within Parliament and encourage people to invest fortunes in get-rich-quick schemes, which often failed. And the one they point to is the so-called South Sea Bubble in the early 18th century. I think it was 1722. Not 18th century, 1722. And a lot of people got wiped out in that, because what the South Sea Company was doing was selling shares in a company that was promising all sorts of financial rewards from developing the Southern Pacific, kind of where you are, and people invested in it, and were wiped out. But the history tells us nobody ever went to jail. In other words, Parliament took care of the right people, so that the people who allowed this to happen and allowed this to be successful that were shielded. Nobody ever went to jail. A lot of private investors were wiped out in this scheme. But that's the experience that many people had with corporations. And in the literature of the early 18th century, which was very critical of the Walpole government, because of its willingness to condone these kinds of schemes, the Cato letters, which were written in opposition to the Walpole administration in England, were very critical of the South Sea Bubble and very critical of corporations. And it's the Cato letters, the letters written by Trenchard and Gordon, that really created the negativism towards corporations that existed in the United States. Because when the colonies were marshaling their case, their argument for independence against the mother country, they cited the Cato letters chapter and verse, because they were all written from an anti-government perspective. And so, in other words, many of the arguments used within England in the Cato letters to criticize the Walpole administration were easily transferred to the colonies in criticizing the behavior of Parliament prior to American independence. So the situations were analogous, and so therefore the use of the letters were appropriate for the colonists as well as they had been when they were written within England. So, and that's the negative attitude is, from the Cato letters and from the schemes, the duplicity and the scheming that went on in Parliament, in government, in order to do favors for particular peoples and stuff. That's the kind of stuff that the Cato letters were filled with. And these were republished in the colonies, in the newspapers, and many people began to read read into this, the idea that that's kind of thing, that's why the colonies are getting screwed. Because there are particular favored interests in England who are getting all the benefits. The merchants, the people that are driving us into deeper and deeper debt that we'll never get out of, and the people that are intentionally lowering the prices that they're willing to pay us for our tobacco, and laws being passed in Parliament which make it illegal for us to manufacture our own goods and require us to send raw materials to the mother country on British ships. In other words, all of this favorable legislation favorable to the mother country was being used to, as a basis for attack. And much of it was in the Cato letters as well. So you're right. That's where the opprobrium or the negativism towards corporations came from. But there's no question. Corporations are the epitome of interest groups. And so the only way that people would condone corporations in America was on the promise that they would be carefully regulated by government. Now, as you point
am I wrong
out,
in thinking that happened like a good deal later, though? I mean, at the time that the Constitution was ratified, corporations were not part of the picture, right?
No, they were not. No, they were. Okay. It seems to me, no, they were. Corporations became very, very prominent after the Constitution was ratified, because government got into the business then of promoting economic development, of promoting growth, encouraging manufacturers, passing legislation in order to encourage American manufacturing by putting high tariffs on imported goods that were flooding the country from Europe, and all of that. And that's the period when, once government became very active in promoting economic development under the heading of the public interest, that's the point at which governments began to create corporations. And Marshall goes out of his way, in 1819, and two of the McCulloch decision and the Dartmouth College decision, to explain and rationalize the need for corporations. Excuse me, but the implication was that they would be carefully regulated. They were created for one purpose and one purpose only. And of course, the people were very familiar with what happened when government got into bed with the corporations. When we had the 18th century equivalent of lobbyists and stuff. And
right.
And now, as you point out, the regulations are gone, and in many cases, government has become the enabler of corporations. Corporations are pretty much able to function without regulation because government has been pretty much stymied in its efforts to try to regulate, try to control. And all of this was rationalized in the late 19th century under the ideas of laissez-faire and the ideas of Darwin and the ideas of evolution and progress in nature only happens if it's not regulated, if it's allowed to be free, if competition for resources is allowed to function uninhibited, unregulated. And so all of these arguments are being used to challenge government's right to regulate business under the theory that it will limit the free market. And the idea,
I was catching those echoes. It's those echoes exactly. When I listened to Madison and his language about individual freedom and liberty and things like that in a political sense, in a social sense, in a more general sense, I keep hearing these reverberations of free markets, and no one actually comes out and says that explicitly.
No.
But it's like you say, like this is really at this particular period in history is a confluence of all these miniature revolutions all over the place. I mean, like Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, wasn't it? I mean,
right, exactly, 1776.
Now, obviously, it didn't hit the bookshelves the next week. I mean, it probably took a while for that to get over into the popular
and again,
consciousness.
It's like Piketty's book on capitalism that's so popular now. I'm guessing that it's like that. I'm drawing a conclusion here. But a lot of people that bought Piketty's book can't read it. I mean, they have no intent to read it. It's all graphs and charts and all that stuff. And so basically, what they depend on is people who have read it to tell them what it says, and why it's important and all of that. And but at the same time, it's very impressive to have a copy of Piketty's book on your coffee table. It makes you look like you're pretty hot stuff.
Right.
And my guess is the same was true with Wealth of Nations. Certain people read it, but the vast majority of people didn't read it. But on the other hand, the propaganda put out by those who did read it made it possible for them to tell people what Adam Smith was saying. And of course the reality is that the Adam Smith that we know about because of what people told us is not the Adam Smith you get from reading the book.
Well, here's my sense, and tell me if I'm sorry.
Adam Smith was not laissez-faire.
Right.
Adam Smith was very, very conscious of the need to take care of the poor and of the need to build and support community. And his argument is that commercial success can only happen when the community is sound and solid and there's universal support for what's happening in the economy.
And we're still having this argument today. I mean, like that's the basis. That's the basis of raising the minimum wage argument, or having a strong labor force, or
You've got to be able to allow everybody to participate. If the economy is going to be successful, it needs to be inclusive, and by definition, unregulated free enterprise, laissez-faire, or something close to it, isn't going to work, because it's going to allow the innate inequality of capitalism. This is Piketty's argument, I believe, that if there's no regulation, then the inequality which is inherent in capitalism will get out of control, and that's exactly what we're into now. That's exactly what's happening.
Or in another metaphor, I mean, like unchecked growth is a bit like a cancer. You have to keep things down, or you end up with something that will
And that to me, that's what I see to be the real relevance of the Pope's encyclical is he basically wants the introduction of the moral question into these economic decisions. In other words, he wants concern for the poor, that not only the poor within a country, but the poor regions of the world, the underdeveloped areas of the world. He wants the poor and their needs to be a consideration of every economic decision that's made. And he's getting all sorts of grief for it, because this violates the intent, or, this makes many of the decisions that are being made look really selfish, because they're so alien to the poor, to the masses of people. I mean, opposition to minimum wage. I mean, people come up with all sorts of arguments against the minimum wage. But the bottom line is, if morality is a major part of what floats your boat, so to speak, then your concern for the poor is going to overwhelm your commitment to something like a competitive market or something like that. And that's what people see. That's what people see the Pope's encyclical being threatening to certain interests, corporations, and among them. So,
for example, if you remove the minimum wage, then sooner or later someone's going to gain an edge by paying lower wages, and you introduce the race to the bottom. Yeah, I guess what the sense I get from like number 10, for instance, here, is that you can't operate a system on 100% honor system. You've got to have I hate to invoke this language, but a trust but verify kind of a thing, where you've got to have a way to back it up.
Yeah.
But it's just like, it just struck me so strongly. It's like I had never. I mean, even when we talk about Charles Beard and we talk about economic interests that were behind the Constitution, and when I read and listen to discussions on these on the Federalist Papers, for instance, I never really thought about, even when considering economic interests, I didn't think about the way the economy itself functioned. Like I didn't think of it in terms of trade. I thought of it in terms of assets and who has stuff, but not how they do business with each other, or not how the whole thing goes together. And it's been one of those questions that's nagged at me for years now. I've always wanted to look deeper into, like, how do we end up with the economy, the economic system we have? Because there's nothing in the Constitution that mandates capitalism. It's just it just happened to be there. It was the cutting edge at the time, and I guess that's what everybody was doing. But it didn't need to be. I mean, like, aside from like language about giving Congress the power to regulate commerce, I mean, if I understand that correctly, Congress could decide tomorrow, that we're going to change our, we're going to turn everything upside down, and we're all within the limits of what Congress shall not, make laws respecting, we could have a completely different economic system in a matter of, as soon as the change could be put into place, all we need is the popular will. So it's always kind of baffled me that we got what we got.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it is really kind of a natural emergence, because all these things kind of they occurred together in a holistic system and not just one.
And I was just going to say that when you talk about the popular will, that there's always a segment here of educating the popular will, of convincing the popular will that certain things are true, and therefore this really is the best and most logical way to go because of the things we all know is true. And that's what one of the things that I was trying to get at earlier about this dark side of human nature. The whole economic system, our whole economy, is driven by the belief that man, more than anything else, is a consumer. His happiness is defined by what he has, by how much wealth he has, or what kind of, or what he owns, or all of these things. And so, basically, the implication is that self-interest is really all that matters, and therefore capitalism is the ideal system because it's a system driven by self-interest and freedom.
But also excellence and virtue, if in the idealistic form of it. If you have the superior product, and if you have the superior work ethic, then you will naturally rise to the top in that view, right? So, and I'm sure they would. I believe, unfortunately, and that's a subjective use of a word, but I believe, unfortunately, that side, the virtue side of the whole equation, has been repressed. It's not talked about. In other words, for example, when everybody talks about human nature and Madison, they go to the idea of men not being angels and factions being sown into the nature of man and all this other stuff. It's the epitome of the maxim that David Hume talked about, which is the basic idea that self-interest and only self-interest is what drives man. And Hume is looking back and saying governments have always used this to justify the power of the ruler. And what I'm saying now, the economic sector is using it to justify unregulated free enterprise and economic development and the entire value system that supports it. And the only way that we can get away with that is not only to promote this negative view of human nature, but to try to document the extent to which it's always been true. And so therefore you go back to Madison, and the Madison that we know is the Madison who talks about factions being sown in the nature of man, and the fact that men are not angels, and the fact that government is a statement, as clear a statement we have of what man's really like, and all of this other stuff. And the stuff that we've seen him talk about the goodness and the sense of honor and all of that, that part of Madison is totally cut out of the books, the textbooks, the classroom, everything. Nobody even knows that side of Madison. That's the way, by controlling curriculum and all that, that's the way that we have promoted and perpetrated the assumptions which drive the development of capitalism. It's I think it's amazing. I mean, it's interesting as hell, but it's also amazing. Well, yeah, and it's a big load to try to get your arms around too. And
I'll tell you, I never I never in my life dreamed that I'd even take it on. I mean, and it's only because of this that I'm willing to try. And I don't know how successful I'm being. I'm guessing that there are a lot of other people out there that might be able to do more and make more sense out of it than I am. But on the other hand, the more I play, the more I feel like I'm learning, and the more excited I get about these things that I never knew before. I never realized before.
Yeah, well, for my part, I love these discussions too. I'm going to back out, and I'll give you the last couple of minutes to yourself.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. Listen,
No,
thank you.
anytime I get a chance, I love it. You know that.
Hey, you have a great. I want to thank you so much for your call. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you again soon, I hope.
Okay, buddy. Thank you.
All right.
What a way to end a week's programming is to spend a half hour with Horst. It's just wonderful, and you know his interest and his enthusiasm is, I find, so infectious. I just thrive at it. I love it, and I appreciate the call. I appreciate all of you who've been with us here this week on the Virtual Center. We still have quite a bit of Madison and Federalist 10 to go, and let me when we wrap up, we got about a minute and a half to do that. I don't want to wrap up by saying what we've covered. I want to basically wrap up by giving some indication of what we haven't. If we go back to Charles Beard and the economic interpretation and Vernon Parrington's main currents of American thought, and those people that picked up on the progressive school and the self-interest of the founders and the extent to which capitalism and the ingredients or the elements of the Constitution are connected. In other words, the extent to which the self-interests of the founders are evident in the Constitution. It seems to me we're potentially doing a tremendous disservice to James Madison. And so far, the Madison that we've read in Federalist number 10 reinforces that view, reinforces the Beardian approach. I believe that there's more to Madison than this. And I believe we're going to see it in the balance of Federalist number 10. And I invite you to join us next week as we take it on. I will say that this is an area that I have never, ever in my life ventured into. So this is going to be new ground for me. I'll do the very best I can, I promise. We're at 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for tuning in today. I want to thank you for tuning in with us all week to the Virtual Center. I want to urge you to continue to support the center and continue to support the Head On Radio Network. Bob Kincaid and his folks are doing a tremendous job. I want to thank you. Thank you for tuning in. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful rest of the week. Be safe, because we want you to be back with us. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center. Thank you.